After all the speculation and anticipation, Paper Mario The Origami King has finally released. As a big fan of the early days of the Paper Mario series, I've been eagerly waiting to get my hands on this game. I've had high hopes that this entry might finally be the return to form for Paper Mario that I and many others have been looking for. If you've been following my channel for the last couple of months, you may be aware of my initial impressions of this game. I posted a couple videos talking about my disappointment and concern at what I saw in the Origami King's trailers. I also posted a video talking about what it is I look for in a Paper Mario game so people would have a better understanding for where I'm coming from. In all three videos, I explicitly stated that I would reserve my final judgment of the Origami King until I've actually had a chance to play it. Now that I've completed the game, I can finally give a full and proper assessment of the newest entry in the Paper Mario series. The Origami King has several good features and a lot of potential, but in all honesty, the ring-based combat ruined the game for me. It was a constant annoyance in an otherwise pleasant game, turning combat into a chore rather than something to look forward to. And don't get me wrong, this game isn't all bad. The environments and the puzzles within them are excellent and easily the best part of the game. There were some real-time combat encounters that were light years better than the ring-based combat. Even the story and characters were decent, though nowhere near as good as the stories and characters from the first three games. The ring-based combat was just so bad that it overshadowed all of these good features for me. In this video, I'm going to go over what you can expect to find in this game and explain why I feel the way that I do. I've broken up this review into three sections, one talking exclusively about combat, one talking about the stories and characters, and one talking about the environments and puzzles. Let's dive in. There's actually three different types of combat in the Origami King. The standard ring-based combat you fight most of the time, boss battles, which are a different take on the ring mechanic, and real-time combat. In standard combat, Mario stands in the middle of a circle with enemies scattered across a series of shifting tiles surrounding him. It's a turn-based system where you start off by moving the tiles to line up enemies in specific formations, then attacking with either your jump, your hammer, or an item. Tiles can either be rotated in a circle or slid vertically. You want to either line up 4 enemies in a row so you can jump on them, or line them up in a 2x2 formation so you can use your hammer. Each fight is basically a puzzle with specific formations the game wants you to make. You only have a limited number of moves you can make to the tiles, so you need to be careful on how you shift enemies around. If you make a mistake and want to undo what you did, you can easily cancel all the moves you made before making your final move. In addition to limited moves, you also have a limited amount of time to make those moves, adding a little bit of pressure. However, if you want more time, you can spend coins to extend how long you have. Lining up enemies correctly will reward you with a damage boost on your next attack. Depending on how many formations the game expected you to make, you will either have 1, 2, or 3 chances to attack. If you fail to defeat all the enemies on your turn, the remaining enemies will have a chance to attack. Once it's your turn again, you will either need to line up the remaining enemies or you will be allowed to finish them off without needing to solve any puzzle. That's pretty much standard combat in a nutshell, so what about this system do I not like? Well, for starters, moving the tiles and solving the combat puzzle were extremely tedious and boring. At the start of the game, the mechanic was simple enough and not too annoying. However, after several hours of shifting enemies around, I just got sick of the whole system. There was nothing exciting about constantly moving tiles around, and there was no real strategy to the whole thing. Every fight had specific formations you were expected to make, so there was no room for creativity or strategy. Once you properly lined up enemies, you basically only chose between 1 jump ability and 2 hammer abilities. You can get more powerful jump and hammer attacks, but they all do the same thing as your basic attacks, they're just stronger. On top of that, these more powerful abilities break after a certain amount of uses, which means you need to constantly keep buying new ones. Which leads to another problem with coins and leveling. There is no leveling system in the Origami King. When you win a fight, the only thing you earn are coins. These coins are used to purchase abilities, items, and accessories, which I'll get to in a minute. Since abilities break, you need to use the coins you've earned to buy replacements. But if you don't engage in combat, your abilities don't break, so you don't need coins from battle to buy new ones, which means there's no point to combat except when it's required by the game. If you like the ring-based combat, great, have at it. but if you don't like it like me, you end up spending the whole game trying to avoid combat as much as possible. While battles are the best source of coins, there are plenty of other ways to earn coins in the world, and again, coins are mainly used to buy stuff for combat. If you avoid combat, you don't need as many coins. The only other useful thing to spend coins on are items called accessories. These items allow you to do things like decrease the amount of damage you take when blocking, or increase the initial amount of time you have to move enemies around. There aren't that many of them, and the only useful one in my opinion was the one that increased your time to line up enemies. Since coins are thrown at you left and right, it's easy to afford whatever accessory you want and to buy as many abilities as you want. Another problem I have with combat involves the damage values that appear when you and enemies attack. These numbers meant absolutely nothing to me. They already started off with fairly high values, numbers that would have been ridiculous in the endgame of the original Paper Marios. These numbers increased when you used more powerful abilities and when you obtained a max-up heart, which increased your health and your attack power, though the game never tells you exactly how much your attack power increases when you find one of these. I basically almost always used the most powerful ability I had when attacking and ignored whatever damage values popped up. All in all, there were just too many problems with the standard ring-based combat for it to be even remotely enjoyable for me. Boss battles and real-time combat, however, were another story. Boss battles also made use of the moving rings, but with an added twist. These fights saw Mario on the outside of the rings and the boss in the center. Instead of scattering enemies across the tiles, the game places arrows and other objects used to fight the boss. The goal in these fights is to use the arrows to guide Mario to specific tiles that he can use to attack. Some spaces have basic attack circles that will allow Mario to attack like normal, while other spaces have magic circles that allow Mario to make use of special abilities that you acquire throughout the game. What makes these fights way more interesting than normal fights is the freedom you are given and the uniqueness of each boss fight. While there are not an infinite number of paths you can take to attack, there are multiple ways to get where you need to go. You have more freedom to be creative with creating your preferred path, which by itself makes boss fights significantly better than normal fights. Each boss also has their own special moves and strategies for beating them that you need to figure out. While these fights do not make me like the ring mechanic, they are certainly a much better implementation of the system. They add a level of strategy to combat that normal battles simply don't have. While boss battles were significantly better than standard fights, real-time combat was the real winner in this game. You will occasionally come across these giant enemies called paper machos, which are basically papier-mâché creations of iconic Mario bad guys. Instead of fighting these enemies in a turn-based format, you fight these opponents in real time by dodging their attacks and using your hammer to destroy them. Each paper macho enemy has an Origami King tag on them that you need to destroy if you want to damage them. Once you remove the tag, you'll be able to damage these enemies anywhere on their bodies once they've stopped moving. What makes these fights so great is that they're not boring. You are actively moving around and dodging attacks while trying to destroy these enemies. There isn't even anything special about these fights, but because the ring-based combat is so bad, it makes these simple, enjoyable encounters stand out. Now, I have no problem with turn-based combat. It's part of the reason I love the first two Paper Mario games so much, but the way it's implemented in this game is just bad. If Nintendo insists on continuing to make Paper Mario an action-adventure instead of an RPG, they should just make the combat real-time like with the Paper Macho enemies or like in Super Paper Mario. Otherwise, make Paper Mario an RPG again with turn-based combat like in the first two games. And both types of games need to have a leveling system to give combat meaning and value. Nintendo keeps trying to mix turn-based combat with an action-adventure style, and it simply isn't working. The story and characters in the Origami King are not great, but they're not bad either. The game starts off with Mario and Luigi traveling to Peach's castle for the Origami Festival. When they arrive, they notice that Toad Town and the castle both seem deserted. When they step inside, Mario is greeted by Princess Peach, who has been folded into origami. After asking Mario if he would like to be turned into origami as well, Peach traps Mario in a dungeon to await his transformation. As he tries to find a way out, Mario meets a strange origami girl named Olivia, as well as a folded up Bowser. Together, the three of them try and escape Peach's castle. When they reach the top, they are greeted by Princess Peach and another origami person named Ollie, who calls himself the Origami King and Olivia's brother. Ollie tells Mario about his plan to get rid of all the toads and turn everyone in the world into origami. He then uses 5 colored streamers to lift Peach's castle and move it to the top of a volcano. Mario, Olivia, and Bowser are all able to escape in time, but Mario and Olivia get separated from Bowser. The two then go on a quest to destroy all the streamers at their source so they can reach Peach's castle and stop Ollie. It's a pretty standard story of you rescuing Princess Peach and saving the day. The reason I'm not a big big fan of the story is that none of the characters stood out to me as memorable. Most of the characters you meet are standard Toads, Koopas, Shy Guys, etc., with nothing distinctive about any of them. I thought Ollie was a pretty weak villain who had a bad reason for doing all of this. Olivia was likable enough, but wasn't anything special. Throughout your journey, you will encounter 3 characters that will join you for part of the game: Bobby, Professor Toad, and Kamek. These partners will travel with you for certain sections and are heavily involved in the stories in these areas. They also assist you in combat, though in a limited capacity. You can't control them in combat, and they only do anything if you fail to defeat the enemies on your first turn. They also have no special abilities outside of combat, except for Professor Toad, who can dig in the desert when prompted. There was nothing wrong with these characters, but just like Olivia, they weren't anything special. They were a far cry from the partners I would expect out of a Paper Mario game. These characters don't bring the game down by any means, but they don't do anything to lift it up either. In terms of the game's tone, I thought the game did a decent job of balancing the creepy vibes with humor. There were some jokes that definitely made me chuckle and reminded me of the Paper Mario of old. However, I thought the game used way too many bad puns. For example, the final bosses in each area were all arts and crafts supplies that made terrible paper puns that got old really fast. As a side note, these bosses were all part of the Legion of Stationery, and they were a terrible addition to this game. The mechanics of these boss fights may have been fine, but the actual opponents left much to be desired. Getting back to the other characters, the Origami King continues Nintendo's obsession with toads. There are toads hidden throughout the world that need to be saved. Some are stuck in the ground, some have been turned into origami, and some have been crumpled up and tossed aside, among other unfortunate fates. When you save these toads, they will start cheering for you in stands while you are in combat. If you offer them coins, they can help you in combat by throwing objects at enemies or by giving you health, which is a feature I barely made use of. Some toads are actually store owners that will open up their shops for you once you've saved them, so that's one reason to seek them out. I still don't understand why Nintendo can't diversify its characters in Paper Mario. In the first Paper Mario, there are a bunch of toads in Toad Town as well, but you have both boy and girl toads, adults and children, and a diversity of toad designs. Many of them even have their own names that aren't just Toad. This will continue to be a criticism I have for this series until Nintendo finally decides to bring this level of diversity back. At the end of the day, the story and characters are adequate enough to work. They're not a reason to buy this game, but they don't do anything to hurt it either. By far the best parts of the Origami King are the environments and the puzzles found throughout them. The game takes you to places as diverse as a mountain set in autumn, a desert filled with ancient monuments and ruins, and a spa floating above the clouds. I was impressed with all 5 locations you explore, as they were all colorful, diverse, and interesting. My favorite locations were a ninja theme park, which just sounds awesome, and the Great Sea, which has its entire quest line pulled directly from Wind Waker. One important thing to note about these locations is that they are all part of one interconnected world. Nintendo finally did away with the overworld map and brought back a hub world that can connect you with the rest of the map. The hub space isn't as interesting as the ones in the first 2 Paper Marios, but it is still a welcome addition to this game. In the first 4 locations, you will go up against bosses called Velumentals. These are giant creatures that command one of 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and ice. Before you can face these enemies, you need to make your way through a small dungeon. These were some of my favorite sections of the game, as they were filled with well-designed puzzles and beautifully crafted interiors. When you defeat a Velumental, you get a new ability that lets your partner Olivia transform into that Velumental. This allows her to use the creature's powers to solve certain puzzles, and can only be used when stepping on a magic circle with that Velumental symbol on it. These magic circles will also start appearing in some boss fights, as they will be necessary for defeating certain bosses. Another magic circle ability involves something called the 1000-fold arms. This folds Mario's arms origami style and allows him to interact with certain objects in the environment. You might peel off part of the wall or smash something instead. The ability makes use of the motion controls, which I found very satisfying. These arms also appear in most boss fights since they are crucial for finishing off many of the bosses. I thought the magic circles were an excellent part of this game that allowed for some very interesting puzzles. They also helped make boss fights more interesting and honestly felt right at home in the Paper Mario series. There was also a fair amount of different activities that you need to complete as part of the story. Some examples include driving a boat across the sea, shooting bob-bombs at paper airplanes, and participating in a game show. Most Most of these were a nice change of pace from the combat and puzzle solving, and they were different enough that they didn't feel repetitive. Two things that I was not a huge fan of were confetti and collectibles. All across the map, there are holes in the environment that need to be patched up. You can throw confetti on them to repair these holes and earn some coins. Collectibles in this game come in the form of trophies depicting people and objects found throughout the game. After you find one, it will be sent to the museum in Toad Town where it is put on display. Otherwise, they serve no other purpose. I thought confetti was a pointless mechanic that didn't need to be added to this game. All they do is give you coins, and honestly, not very many of them. It's not an enjoyable mechanic to do and simply serves as a gimmick. The collectibles are also a waste of time. They don't get you anything, which makes them useless in my opinion. The first two Paper Mario games also had collectibles called star pieces, but the difference is those star pieces could be used to buy powerful badges, which made them worth seeking out. I have no incentive to seek out these collectible trophies. The last thing I'll mention about the Origami King is the soundtrack. Some of the music in this game is pretty great, especially some of the boss music. It's not my favorite soundtrack of the series, but it's definitely a high point of this game. So that's my review. This game definitely has some things going for it, but it's ultimately held back by its terrible ring-based combat. The Origami King made some solid improvements, and it's definitely a better game than both Sticker Star and Color Splash, but it's still a far cry from the first three games in the series. Hopefully Paper Mario will one day return to the greatness it once knew. For now, I look at the Origami King as a step in the right direction, but still very far from where it needs to go.